The land had been in the Walker family for nearly a century before trouble arrived, before paved roads and power lines crept into the hills, before land developers discovered the valley and carved cul-de-sacs near pastures where cattle once grazed without fences, before outsiders arrived with clipped accents, manicured lawns, and misinformed ideas about how country life should look. Life on the Walker Ranch had always been shaped by honest work, sweat, unpredictable weather, and the slow rhythm of cattle moving through tall grass. It was not glamorous, but it was real. Ethan Walker carried that legacy in every step he took. Every day he woke before dawn, checked water lines, rode the perimeter fences, and worked alongside his aging father to keep the ranch alive. The land fed their cattle, and the cattle fed their livelihood. It had never been easy, but it had always been theirs, pure, untamed, and paid for with generations of hard work rather than bank loans and developer money. Then came the day everything changed. It began with the sale of a neighboring property, a parcel of 20 acres that had sat empty for decades. No one expected it to sell, at least not to anyone who would stay long. The terrain was too rough, too far from the main road to attract typical city buyers. But then a new structure appeared almost overnight. First came construction workers and concrete trucks. Then a massive modular home was hauled in. Giant windows framed the entire front like a glass showroom. It was the kind of place that glistened with empty wealth, big, bold, and without a soul. The new neighbor came with it. She arrived in a spotless white SUV that looked like it had never seen a dirt road in its life. Her clothes were expensive and impractical, unsuited for the mud and grit of ranch country. Her blonde hair was controlled into perfection. Her sunglasses were oversized and reflective. She radiated something Ethan recognized instantly, someone who came not to adapt but to impose. She carried herself as if nature itself was beneath her. Her name was Karen Blake. The townsfolk whispered about her before she even finished moving in. She had come from a wealthy suburb 3 states away, divorced from some corporate executive and carrying enough settlement money to survive without working another day. She claimed she wanted peace and quiet, yet she immediately began complaining about everything that made country life what it was. Dirt roads ruined her vehicle. Wildlife made her nervous. Coyotes howled too loudly at night. She called the county office more in her first 2 weeks than the previous owner had in 10 years. But it was not her complaints about roads or coyotes that would ignite a war. It was the cattle. Ethan's herd grazed along the property line adjacent to Karen's newly built luxury home. To Ethan, it was a normal sight, evidence of a functioning ranch. But to Karen, the cattle were nothing but a nuisance. She hated the sounds they made. She complained about flies. She said the dust bothered her allergies. And then came the ultimate grievance, the smell. That was when she declared war. At first, it came as petty harassment. She hired a land surveyor to question Ethan's fence line. She filed noise complaints with the sheriff's department. She put up no trespassing signs along her property line as if Ethan had any interest in stepping foot on her land. Then she sent letters through a local attorney accusing the ranch of violating environmental standards. Ethan ignored them. He had work to do. But ignoring Karen did not make her go away. It only made her escalate. Soon, she began driving her SUV along the fence line, deliberately honking to spook the cattle. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming Ethan's cattle were trespassed on her land, despite the fence clearly belonging to him. When that didn't work, she tried to claim that his ranch posed a threat to public health and safety. Once again, nothing came of it. But Karen would not stop, and Ethan would not bend. What Ethan didn't know was that Karen had come prepared for a fight. She had moved to the country with a false sense of superiority. She believed money gave her power. She believed people like Ethan, quiet, weathered by labor, loyal to their land, were beneath her. People she could push, people she could control, people she could break. Her plan had only just begun. The day of trespass came 2 months after she moved in, a hot, dry afternoon with a brutal wind sweeping through the valley. Ethan was working in the barn when he saw dust rising from the far end of his property. It was Karen's SUV, driving directly onto his land. At first, he thought she must have mistakenly crossed into his field, but when she stopped beside the pasture gate and stepped out with 2 men carrying bolt cutters, Ethan understood. She had come for his fence. Watching from a distance, Ethan felt a cold anger settle inside him. This was no accident. Karen had brought hired hands to tear down his boundary. She was not confused. This was intentional. She believed she had the right to do whatever she wanted, even if it meant destroying someone else's property. What she didn't know was that she had just made a fatal mistake. Trespassing in ranch country was not just a sign of disrespect. It was a declaration, and for a landowner, it was both personal and legal. By the time Ethan rode out to the pasture, the damage had already begun. Karen had ordered the men to cut sections of the barbed wire and pull down posts. But the real shock came not from the destruction, but from the arrogance. Karen stood with crossed arms, scanning the field as if she owned it. She had no fear, no hesitation, no remorse. Her attack was silent, merciless, and calculated. Ethan didn't confront her, not yet. He simply watched from afar, hidden by a slight hill. He memorized Eve, dry detail, every action, every face. He knew the law of the land better than she ever would. And no matter how many petty complaints she filed, this time, she had crossed the line. Karen left the ranch that day without a scratch, but the damage she left behind was enough to cause chaos. With the fence cut open, several cattle wandered into the road, and one veered dangerously close to a rocky ravine. Ethan spent hours repairing what he could, but the insult stayed burning in his chest. He knew this was only the beginning. Karen had tested him once. She would do it again. But she had forgotten something crucial. Out here, the land remembers everything, and the law stands with those who defend what is theirs. As the sun set that day, Ethan made a decision. He would not fight her with anger. He would not confront her with emotion. He would use patience, precision, and above all, evidence. The next battle would not take place on a fence line. It would take place in a courtroom, and Karen Blake would never see it coming. The morning after Karen's trespass felt colder than usual, though the weather had not changed. The sky stretched wide and blue over the Walker Ranch. The cattle moved with their calm, unhurried rhythm across the land, and the wind slid softly over the dry grass. Everything looked the same, but something had shifted. Something had awakened inside Ethan. A resolve, a promise, a controlled, silent fury. The Walker family believed in handling their own problems. Over decades, they had faced drought, predators, market crashes, and blizzards that buried cattle alive. But what was unfolding now was unlike any hardship brought by nature. This was a calculated human attack, one born out of arrogance, entitlement, and ignorance of the land. And Ethan understood something Karen Blake did not. Ranchers do not survive by muscle alone. They survive by strategy. He knew she would strike again. That was the nature of people like her. They believed persistence was power. They believed laws were weapons to be bent. They believed silence was weakness. But Karen would not stop, and Ethan would not bend. What Ethan didn't know was that Karen had come prepared for a fight. She had moved to the country with a false sense of superiority. She believed money gave her power. She believed people like Ethan, quiet, weathered by labor, loyal to their land, were beneath her. People she could push, people she could control, people she could break. Her plan had only just begun. The day of trespass came 2 months after she moved in, a hot, dry afternoon with a brutal wind sweeping through the valley. Ethan was working in the barn when he saw dust rising from the far end of his property. It was Karen's SUV, driving directly onto his land. At first, he thought she must have mistakenly crossed into his field. But when she stopped beside the pasture gate and stepped out with two men carrying bolt cutters, Ethan understood. She had come for his fence. Watching from a distance, Ethan felt a cold anger settle inside him. This was no accident. Karen had brought hired hands to tear down his boundary. She was not confused. This was intentional. She believed she had the right to do whatever she wanted, even if it meant destroying someone else's property. What she didn't know was that she had just made a fatal mistake. Trespassing in ranch country was not just a sign of disrespect. It was a declaration, and for a landowner, it was both personal and legal. By the time Ethan rode out to the pasture, the damage had already begun. Karen had ordered the men to cut sections of the barbed wire and pull down posts. But the real shock came not from the destruction, but from the arrogance. Karen stood with crossed arms, scanning the field as if she owned it. She had no fear, no hesitation, no remorse. Her attack was silent, merciless, and calculated. Ethan didn't confront her, not yet. He simply watched from afar, hidden by a slight hill. He memorized Eve, dry detail, every action, every face. He knew the law of the land better than she ever would. And no matter how many petty complaints she filed, this time, she had crossed the line. Karen left the ranch that day without a scratch. But the damage she left behind was enough to cause chaos. With the fence cut open, several cattle wandered into the road, and one veered dangerously close to a rocky ravine. Ethan spent hours repairing what he could, but the insult stayed burning in his chest. He knew this was only the beginning. Karen had tested him once. She would do it again. But she had forgotten something crucial. Out here, the land remembers everything, and the law stands with those who defend what is theirs. As the sun set that day, Ethan made a decision. He would not fight her with anger. He would not confront her with emotion. He would use patience, precision, and above all, evidence. The next battle would not take place on a fence line. It would take place in a courtroom, and Karen Blake would never see it coming. The morning after Karen's trespass felt colder than usual, though the weather had not changed. The sky stretched wide and blue over the Walker Ranch. The cattle moved with their calm, unhurried rhythm across the land, and the wind slid softly over the dry grass. Everything looked the same, but something had shifted. Something had awakened inside Ethan. A resolve, a promise, a controlled, silent fury. The Walker family believed in handling their own problems. Over decades, they had faced drought, predators, market crashes, and blizzards that buried cattle alive. But what was unfolding now was unlike any hardship brought by nature. This was a calculated human attack, one born out of arrogance, entitlement, and ignorance of the land. And Ethan understood something Karen Blake did not. Ranchers do not survive by muscle alone. They survive by strategy. He knew she would strike again. That was the nature of people like her. They believed persistence was power. They believed laws were weapons to be bent. They believed silence was weakness. But Karen had misjudged her opponent, mistaking calm for surrender. She believed Ethan was too simple to fight back, too rural, too quiet, too uneducated in the world of paperwork and legal maneuvering. She could not have been more wrong. Ethan spent the next 2 weeks preparing, without ever saying a word. Instead of confronting Karen, he let her continue believing she was winning. He did not repair the fence immediately. Instead, he closed it temporarily with rails and a cattle gate so he could fix it properly later. He did not call Karen, did not meet her lawyer, and did not bother answering her latest letter accusing him of public agricultural negligence. Instead, he set a plan in motion that she would never see coming. He began with the most important move, evidence. On the far side of the pasture where Karen had trespassed, he installed 3 trail cameras. They were small, camouflaged, and motion-activated, hidden in trees and fence posts, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't already know they were there. These cameras were not ordinary wildlife cameras. They were infrared, recorded audio, and uploaded footage directly to a cloud drive. Even if destroyed, everything was already saved elsewhere. Karen had made one mistake already, believing she could act without being seen. Now Ethan would see everything. Next, he reinforced key areas of the ranch, not with more barbed wire, but with signs, legal signs. They were simple metal warnings, but powerful in the eyes of the law. No trespassing, private property, surveillance in use. Next came livestock area, unauthorized entry strictly prohibited. And finally, warning, entering ranch property without permission violates state agricultural code. These signs were not for Karen. These were for the sheriff, the county judge, and the district attorney. These signs were legal proof that the Walker Ranch was visibly and clearly protected by private property law. Anyone who entered without permission now did so knowingly and could be prosecuted. But Ethan was not done. He also pulled out a stack of old ranch documents, land plats, deed history, grazing permits, property surveys done by his grandfather. Every line of fencing was mapped, every waterway and access point accounted for. Hidden among his father's dusty records, Ethan found a quiet weapon, a recorded easement from 1974 giving the Walker family permanent rights to maintain fencing along that very property line, long before Karen Blake ever existed in their world. She had accused him of trespassing with his fence. She was wrong by 51 years. But Ethan kept that paper folded and hidden in a heavy, dark folder. Evidence was ammunition, and he had just started loading the chamber. Days passed. Ethan returned to work as if life was normal. He moved cattle to a fresh grazing area, repaired a windmill, burned brush piles before the fire ban took hold. To anyone who didn't look closely, he was just another man working through another week. But behind that calm routine, surveillance footage began filling up with exactly what he expected. Karen Blake was obsessed. She drove along his fence line almost every day, phone in hand, recording his land, his equipment, and his cattle. She paced back and forth at the property boundary, pointing cameras at his home. She stopped workers on the road and tried to ask about the ranch. She even parked by his barn one morning and sat there for 22 minutes, simply watching, as if planning something. But the cameras captured something else, something Ethan hoped for, but did not count on. Karen trespassed again. On a Wednesday morning, at 10:17 a.m., she walked directly onto his land, phone out, scanning the cattle with disgust. She inspected the pasture. She crossed 3 separate fence posts. She took photos and videos. She even picked up one of his mineral tubs and threw it over the fence into her property line as if it offended her. The cameras saw everything. That was the moment Ethan's patience turned into victory. Later that same day, a county letter arrived at the ranch. Another complaint from Karen demanding Ethan relocate his cattle because the odor posed a public health emergency. The letter required a response within 10 days. Ethan pinned it to his wall without opening it. It would never matter, because by then he had already filed something far more powerful. He drove into town to the county sheriff's office with a simple evidence package. Inside, printed still images of Karen trespassing, time-stamped surveillance logs, GPS coordinates proving she crossed onto his land, and, most importantly, a sworn affidavit. Quiet, simple, calm, official, legal, no anger, no confrontation, just facts. Karen Blake had violated private property law, agricultural security laws, and livestock tampering statutes. She had interfered with a working ranch and caused liability risk to livestock. These were not simple trespassing charges. In their county, these were criminal offenses. But Ethan didn't ask for criminal charges alone. He asked for a restraining order, legally banning Karen from his land and requiring her to remain at least 300 feet away from his boundary. He also filed a civil claim for property destruction and livestock endangerment. Once filed, the sheriff's department was obligated to serve her. 3 days later, Karen received that knock at her door, the one she never expected. The deputy handed her a court summons. She erupted in outrage, but outrage has no legal power. She stormed into the sheriff's office only to learn Ethan had followed protocol at every step. Everything was lawful. Everything was documented. Everything was already in the court system. She had been outplayed. Ranchers do not go to war loudly. They build for it quietly. Karen thought she had walked into a feud. She had actu. Allie walked into a trap. The war had only just begun, but the battleground had now been chosen. It would not be fought over fences or landlines. It would be fought in the courtroom, where evidence speaks louder than money and trespassers learn the price of arrogance. And while Ethan stayed calm, Karen was just beginning to crumble. She did not yet realize that every step she took from this moment on would only tighten the noose she had woven for herself. The law was now involved, and the land remembers everything. The news of Karen Blake's court summons spread through the small rural county faster than a wildfire in August. In towns like Hollow Ridge, nothing stayed secret long, especially not conflict. People talked about it in the feed store, in the diner over black coffee, at the volunteer fire station, even in the small church off County Road 12. A rancher filing legal action against a newcomer was not unusual. But a newcomer filing endless complaints about a working ranch, then getting slammed with criminal trespassing charges, that was something the town hadn't seen in years. Karen had no idea she had crossed a community boundary far more powerful than any fence. She had declared war on rural life itself, and Hollow Ridge did not take kindly to outsiders who tried to change tradition. Families didn't move there for modern rules or manicured suburbs. They lived there because life made sense in a place where work mattered more than titles, trust more than appearance, and a person's word still held weight. But Karen cared nothing about local values. She only cared about winning. She hired an aggressive attorney from a private law firm in the city, one who boasted about bulldozing through small-town nonsense. She filed a counterclaim demanding Ethan relocate his cattle and pay $250,000 in property disturbance damages. She accused him of intentionally contaminating her air, ruining her property value, and causing emotional distress. Her lawyer submitted a packet of exaggerated photographs, close-ups of cow manure, flies captured mid-flight, zoomed-in mud clumps, to paint the illusion of a toxic wasteland next door. But no photo changed the truth. Ethan had broken no law. He had violated no ordinance. His ranch existed long before Karen's dream home polluted the valley with its artificial presence. He had documentation, history, and agricultural zoning on his side. Karen only had personal disgust disguised as legal argument. Still, she believed she would win, because she believed the world bowed to money. She didn't understand something fundamental about Hollow Ridge. Courts there respected the land and those who worked it. The county judge had once been a rancher himself, and his wife had grown up mending fences and helping calves survive winter storms. The sheriff had family in agriculture. Half the courtroom had dirt under their fingernails and boots older than Karen's SUV. They didn't see cattle as filth. They saw them as life, economy, hard work, legacy. And Karen was about to walk into that courtroom with contempt for everything it stood for. On the day of the hearing, Ethan walked into the courthouse alone, not because nobody would stand with him, but because he chose to keep his fight personal. He wore a clean buttoned shirt, jeans, and a belt with a worn buckle passed down from his father. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. He carried quiet conviction like a shield. Karen entered moments later wearing luxury clothing and a jacket better suited for a fashion magazine than a courtroom. Her hair was styled, her nails immaculately done. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't meet any eyes. She moved with entitlement, followed closely by her attorney, who radiated smug certainty. She took her seat and crossed her legs like the courtroom belonged to her. She didn't notice the way people stared at her, not with admiration or curiosity, but with the cold, steady gaze of people who had already judged her character. But Karen didn't believe character mattered. She believed only presentation did. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The judge entered. Formalities were made. Statements were read. Karen's attorney attacked first. He tried to insinuate that Ethan's ranch was a health hazard, that the cattle were too close to residential development, that the stench was unbearable, and that his client had moved to Hollow Ridge to find peace, only to be tortured by an unclean, careless neighbor. He demanded Ethan be forced to relocate his cattle and change his entire way of life because Karen had chosen to live beside a ranch. He argued with dramatic language. He gestured like a stage actor. He submitted printed photos of manure and attempted to make the courtroom gasp. He even accused Ethan of refusing mediation and escalating the conflict. But then it was Ethan's turn. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't defend himself with emotional appeals. He simply submitted one folder. Inside were still frame images of Karen trespassing, GPS timestamps, footage logs, an old ranch survey that confirmed the fence placement since 1974. A county-approved land history document proving agricultural designation, a signed affidavit documenting property damage, and the legal easement that gave him the permanent right to maintain his ranch boundary. He also submitted something else, something Karen never saw coming. A livestock law notice, sectioned under state agricultural code. Tampering with livestock is a criminal offense punishable by law. The footage clearly showed Karen throwing a mineral tub, the primary source of nutrition and minerals for grazing cattle, off Ethan's land. In the eyes of the state, that was tampering. Her arrogance had just crossed into criminal territory again. The judge didn't need long to decide. Karen trespassed. Karen destroyed property. Karen interfered with livestock. The restraining order was approved. Karen was legally banned from Ethan's ranch, barred from approaching within 300 feet of his boundary, and ordered to pay for the damaged section of fence. Her counterclaim? Dismissed, with prejudice, meaning she could never file the same claim again. Ethan had won. But the judge didn't stop there. Karen was also ordered to attend a mandatory agricultural awareness hearing to learn about ranching practices if she wanted to avoid criminal charges. The courtroom was stunned. Ethan remained still. Karen seethed. Her attorney protested. It didn't matter. Justice had been served. But in Karen's eyes, she wasn't defeated, only challenged. Her pride grew teeth. Her temper sharpened. She believed she had been humiliated, and humiliation had always been the one thing she refused to accept. So she left the courtroom not broken, but burning. Ethan watched her storm out, aware that she was not done. He saw the rage in her walk, the fury in her shoulders. He knew revenge was already building inside her. She was not the kind to retreat. She was the kind to escalate. But this time, she would not just come after Ethan. She would come after everything he cared about. She would go deeper, dirtier, far more dangerous. But that was fine, because Ethan had known from the beginning that this wouldn't end quickly. Karen Blake had stepped onto a battlefield she did not understand, and she had underestimated a man who defended his land not out of pride, but out of duty. Ranchers do not strike fast, they strike last, and when they do, nothing is left standing. Karen thought she could stage a war, but a storm was already gathering around her, and she had no idea how far Ethan was willing to go to protect what was his. The days following the courtroom ruling were unsettlingly quiet, like the stillness before a storm. The ranch carried on as usual. Cattle grazed, windmills spun slowly in the breeze, and dust rose in soft brown clouds under the tires of Ethan's old truck. But beneath that normal rhythm law, the attention that weighed heavy on the land. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen Blake was not the type to walk away defeated. Humiliation had ignited something inside her, something vicious and irrational, and Ethan knew it. He didn't sleep as deeply at night anymore. He checked his cameras twice a day. He rode fence lines not only to inspect them, but to watch for signs that someone had been there. Tire tracks, footprints, broken branches, things out of place. The land always spoke if a person knew how to listen. He also noticed something else. Karen had disappeared. Her SUV was gone for 3 days. No movement at her house, no new complaints filed, no signs of activity. To anyone else, it might have seemed like she had given up. But Ethan could sense her absence was strategic, not surrender. She wasn't finished. She was plotting, planning, waiting for the right moment to hit him harder than before. She wouldn't fight where the law could see her. This time, she would go dirty. The attack came at dusk on a windy evening, 4 days after Karen's courtroom loss. Ethan was closing the barn doors when he smelled it. A smell no rancher ever forgets. A smell that can make a man run before he even understands why. Smoke. Not from a fireplace. Not from brush burning. This smoke was sharp. Wrong. Desperate. Coming from the south pasture, the one closest to Karen's property line. He took off running. The wind pushed harder now, a restless western gust tearing across the field. When Ethan reached the top of the rise, he saw it, an orange, flickering glow spreading through the dry grass, climbing fast toward the tree line. Flames snapped and twisted, hungry and alive, lighting up the night in jagged bursts of red and gold. Fire, the most feared enemy of ranch country, was racing across his land. And this one wasn't an accident. At the ignition point, barely hidden by a broken whiskey bottle and a trail of blackened starter fluid, the truth was obvious. Someone had set this. Someone had walked onto his land and poured fuel onto his grass. Someone had tried to burn his ranch to the ground. And Ethan knew exactly who. There was no time to think. Fire moved fast in dry country heat, faster than a man could run. Ethan sprinted to the barn, started the water pump, grabbed hoses and shovels. He didn't wait for the volunteer fire crew. Every minute mattered. Flames traveled low at first, then reached up, grabbing at brush and tree limbs, sending crackling embers flying forward like burning bullets. He fought like a man possessed. He carved trenches in the dirt with a shovel, trying to rob the fire of fuel. He soaked posts and rail fences, turning them dark and dripping wet. He shouted for cattle, pushing them through the smoke toward safer ground. The heat burned his face. His throat turned raw. Sweat and soot ran down his arms. Still he fought, refusing to let the blaze consume his family's history. Then, headlights appeared. Trucks. Neighbors. Without being called, without being asked, they came. 2 ranchers from the North Ridge, a father and son from the neighboring farm, a mechanic from town. They arrived carrying water tanks, beaters, heavy boots, and unspoken loyalty. No one asked who started the fire. No one had to. They all already knew. This wasn't a wildfire. This was war. By midnight, the fire was contained. It didn't take the house. It didn't reach the barn. But it burned hard through 20 acres of good grazing pasture and took down a mature shade tree older than Ethan's father. A small section of fence was gone. A calf had gone missing in the smoke, and 1 cow was badly burned along her back. Ethan stayed with her long into the night, treating the burns with water and salve while she trembled in pain. Fire scars a land in more ways than one. By morning, ash covered the blackened soil. The pasture was gone, turned to a silent graveyard of char and smoke. And still, no word from Karen. Not a car seen on her driveway. Nothing. But Ethan didn't need her words. He had her mistake. When the sheriff arrived to investigate, he walked slowly through the scene. He didn't hide the anger in his eyes. This wasn't property damage anymore. This was arson. This was criminal. This could have taken lives. Ethan didn't say much. He simply led the sheriff to the southern fence. There, hung on a post just feet from the ignition point, still in plain view of the pasture, was a camera. A hidden trail camera. Still recording, still uploading. The sheriff's face changed. Ethan didn't rush him. He didn't demand justice. He didn't shout accusations. He simply opened his phone and played a clip, taken the night before, time-stamped only 30 minutes before the fire began. There she was, Karen Blake, trespassing again, carrying a fuel can, walking straight across his pasture. The sheriff didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The evidence was undeniable. Ethan had just taken the conflict to a point of no return. This wasn't about fences or flies or cattle anymore. This was now a matter of law, of danger, of life. And Ethan was done defending. Now he would destroy. Quietly, legally, completely. He would take everything from Karen Blake, not with rage, not with revenge born of emotion, but with methodical, unstoppable force. She had played with fire. Now she would burn. The courtroom was not a place where ranchers often found themselves, yet today the old wooden benches were filled with hats, boots, and calloused hands resting on denim jeans. Half the county had shown up, not out of curiosity, but loyalty. The Carson family had worked those hills for 5 generations, and in the countryside, legacy wasn't measured in money, but in miles of fence repaired, calves delivered in the freezing dark, and food put on neighbors' tables without being asked. So when a stranger tried to destroy that way of life, people thought, he took notice, and they chose a side. Opposing them, Karen Hudson sat polished and poised behind her legal team. She wore a black designer suit with a white silky blouse, and her hair was swept back like a corporate general preparing for a hostile takeover. At her side sat attorney Charles Delaney, a pristine city lawyer with a Harvard smugness that even his tailored suit couldn't disguise. They radiated confidence. To them, this was already won. This was small-town justice, easy to manipulate, easy to dominate, or so they thought. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. The case was simple on paper. Karen Hudson versus Jake Carson, civil claims. She accused him of multiple violations of public nuisance, health hazards, emotional distress, and environmental damage caused by his ranching operation. She asked for the court to grant a temporary restraining order to halt his livestock operations entirely until a full environmental review was completed. The intent was clear: cut off his income, cripple his livelihood, and force a sale. It was a move only a wealthy predator could afford to make. But this wasn't going to go how she planned. From the moment the proceedings began, there was a shift in the air. Karen's legal team opened strong, showing drone photos of the ranch, enlarged pictures of cattle pens and mud, graphs of air quality complaints, numbers and data that meant nothing to the life of a ranch, but they painted a grim portrait for anyone unfamiliar with agriculture. They talked about methane emissions, animal cruelty concerns, even referencing fraudulent reports from fake experts Karen had found online. People willing to give testimony for a price. The courtroom watched silently as their polished presentation filled the air with accusations. But something was missing. Evidence that mattered. Then it was Jake's turn. He didn't walk in alone. Sitting beside him was a quiet presence, a woman in her 40s with rugged professionalism and calm intelligence. She had been in the courtroom the whole time, unnoticed by Karen's side, but she wouldn't stay unnoticed for long. Her name was Rebecca Ortiz, livestock attorney, former deputy district attorney, and an expert in agricultural law. And she was Jake's secret weapon. She began the defense, not with emotion, not with anger, but with precision. She dismantled every accusation with state livestock law. She cited Section 15.7 of the County Agricultural Preservation Statute, guaranteeing right-to-farm protections. She produced certified safety inspections from the county health board, verifying Jake's ranch was fully compliant. She exposed the so-called experts Karen presented as unqualified frauds. One had been banned from testifying in 3 states. Then she revealed the first surprise: hidden camera photographs. Not from Jake's security, but from the sheriff's department. The judge allowed them into evidence over Karen's objections. Photograph after photograph appeared on the courtroom monitor. Karen trespassing on private ranch land, cutting fences, placing sharp objects under tires, releasing livestock gates at night. In one image, she was seen dumping packets of spoiled meat and garbage near cattle pens, creating the very health hazard she accused Jake of. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen shifted in her seat. Then came the second surprise: a noise complaint log. Karen had made exactly 173 complaint calls to county authorities in 90 days. Officers had logged each visit, noting no violations. But hidden within the records were statements from neighbors who claimed Karen harassed them as well, firing leaf blowers at sunrise, playing sirens through outdoor speakers, driving up and down property lines, filming cattle workers. Complaints had been filed against her. Now it was Karen who was on defense. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She clicked to the next slide. A property deed. Karen's home, Lot 32, sits within the county's agricultural buffet zone. The zoning contract she signed clearly stated, "This is active cattle country. You will experience noise, livestock movement, and organic smells. Do not purchase if this conflicts with your expectations." Karen's attorney rose, objecting. The judge overruled. The truth was laid bare. Karen had no case. She had knowingly moved next to an operating cattle ranch, then tried to destroy it. Then came the final blow. Rebecca rose slowly, voice steady, and said she would be filing a counterclaim, not for damages, but for criminal trespass, willful property destruction, fraudulent claims to government agencies, and agricultural sabotage. Sabotage was a felony. It carried prison time. Karen's face went pale. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs. Rebecca placed one last piece of evidence before the judge. Printed emails from Karen organizing a homeowners campaign encouraging neighbors to file coordinated false complaints against the ranch to force them out. It was a direct attempt to interfere with an agricultural business, which was a federal offense under the Food and Agriculture Interference Act. The courtroom was silent now. Everyone knew what was coming next. Before the judge could speak, County Prosecutor Mark Ledbetter stood from the gallery. He stepped forward with a formal notice. The sheriff's department would be opening a criminal investigation against Karen Hudson. Her legal team fell silent. The judge recessed for review. Karen's picture-perfect confidence shattered. She looked around desperately, but there was no one left to impress, no neighbor to manipulate, no authority to intimidate. And in the back row sat the people she underestimated, the rural community she believed beneath her. They didn't gloat, but they didn't pity her either, because out here, you don't pick a fight with people who know how to survive. The judge returned. A decision was coming. And this story was far from over. The morning of the final court decision unfolded under a steel-gray sky that hinted at rain. The courthouse stood tall against the horizon like a monument of Wyatt's, their justice. Plain, old, and unchanging, despite the battles that raged inside. Today would decide everything. Jake Carson's legacy, his father's land, his right to continue the life his family had bled to build, all of it hung in the balance. But this day no longer felt uncertain. The storm had already broken. What remained were only the consequences. Karen Hudson entered the courtroom flanked by her lawyers, but she looked nothing like the manicured suburban conqueror who had first marched into this town with arrogance and entitlement. Her posture was stiff, her eyes hollowed by sleepless panic, and her once confident stride was now hesitant. Her legal team no longer carried folders or exhibits or sleek binders filled with accusations. They had brought nothing because they had nothing left. Across the aisle, Jake Carson sat calm and grounded in silence. Not victorious, but resolute. His hands were clasped, his face was solemn, and though he was surrounded by neighbors, he seemed alone, carrying the weight of generations that depended on him holding this ground. Behind him sat faces from nearly every ranch within 100 miles, men and women who had traveled far through dust and wind to be there. They were quiet, but their presence spoke louder than words. Livestock attorney Rebecca Ortiz remained steady beside Jake, reviewing final documents with meticulous care. This was no longer about avoiding defeat. It was about delivering justice, complete and undeniable. The judge entered and everyone rose. When they sat again, tension settled like a physical weight in the room. The judge began by summarizing the case, an uncommon formality, but perhaps he felt this case deserved official clarity. Karen Hudson had filed civil charges against Jake Carson for public nuisance, emotional distress, environmental hazard, and property devaluation. The judge referred to the evidence as weak, exaggerated, malicious, and in some instances, falsified. Her accusations were based not on reality, but on a personal vendetta. One by one, he recited findings, all government in spe,